My name is Ronald Chapman. Depending upon which business we're talking about, I'm either the CEO of one of my two businesses or I'm an advisor in one of the roles that I play. I've got multiple businesses that I'm holding down or responsible for. One of them is as a strategic advisor, facilitator, consultant in the field of public health. That's a business called Leading Public Health. I have another business which is a little more visionary and puts me into a lot of advisory work more broadly outside public health. It's called Magnetic North LLC. And then the work I've been doing that brings me to this conference is actually a body of work known as Seeing True, where I essentially play some strange mix between philosopher and advisor, and occasionally I get accused of being a transformationalist because of the nature of the work I do, and so that one's a little harder to put a job title to. I mean, the honest truth is that what happens is I show up and I do what work is needed with people, and they then give me titles that sort of describe what their experience of me was. Well, in order to understand how I got into this present body of work, I really got to go back a little bit in time. When I got out of college, I ended up in the private sector doing a lot of what amounted to leadership and strategy work, and it was an outstanding foundation. It ran its course after about 10 years, and it was obvious it was time to go do something else. The best idea I had at the time was to go get a master's degree in social work, and so for all intents and purposes, I consider myself a social worker, even though my original background was leadership and finance and strategy. I spent about 5 years in the not-for-profit sector learning that world, and then in '95, I decided to start my own business by basically doing what many of us do. I put together a business card that said I wanted to do strategy work, some leadership consulting, facilitation, anything that might help organizations. What has been really interesting about that is, and there's a beauty about this, that you create a plan and then you start adapting as soon as your plan is done, because the world is constantly dynamic. So what's happened is that platform has become increasingly one for me to show up in the world and do the things that clients need. The truth of the matter is, many of the skills I have now actually weren't developed because I wanted them. They were developed because a client asked me if I would use them with them. And so my portfolio has actually been, if we were talking about this from a business point of view, my portfolio has been built by what marketing has told me I needed. And in some strange way, it all adds up to being a guy who can work in difficult spaces doing whatever work a client might need. Well, interestingly enough, when I started working with Ozark Mountain Publishing with my second book, a book called Seeing True, 90 Contemplations in 90 Days, they were one of those who said, well, we need to be able to explain to people who you are. So we came up with a transformational philosopher, which I think is really pretty entertaining, which basically means I have a lot of ideas. Most of them are all focused on this idea of seeing true. And the way I talk about seeing true, I actually have to go back to the Greeks, who had a word called metanoia. That word literally translates as a profound change of heart. And what we know about ourselves in the world, if you pay much attention to people, is that when you have a radical change of direction, when someone's life is transformed, it's always coincident with this profound alteration in the way we see or view ourselves, our world, our role in it. And so this whole idea that if you can get people to see things a certain way, a way that's unique to each of us, you have the opportunity that you can snap into an entirely new vantage point, and that just plain changes lives. That can run, so a real simple example of this is the classic medical story where you got typically a guy, typically middle-aged, he suddenly has terrible heart or some other form of challenges, and literally overnight, behaviors change. Under the presence of life-threatening feedback, literally lives change course overnight. I saw this for the first time with an older guy who was in his 70s, and literally he went overnight from no exercise to walking 6 miles a day. He cut all the terrible food out of his diet, even though for decades people had been telling him he ought to do that. He stopped drinking all alcohol. Just this whole range of incredible behavioral changes, literally overnight. And last time I talked to him, he's still doing all those things 15 years later. He's approaching 90 years old. And so you have to ask yourself, why does that kind of transformation take place? And that's the space that I like to play in, whether it's an individual, whether it's professional, personal, is helping people get a good look, seeing true, because I know that if they ever get a good look at it, it can change everything in a way that is very, very beneficial to them. And so I'll share the funny part, which is I love it. It's like, man, when you see these magical things happen with people, I just can't, I can't stay away from it. It's what drives me. And I'll add one more thing to that. If you talk to one of my professional range of clients, some of this information would come a surprise to them. They wouldn't understand seeing true language or any of that, because what I've learned how to do is to take the principles and apply them in setting. I use a kind of language for corporations. I use a kind of language for public health. In a spiritual setting, such as this conference we're at, I use a different kind of language, because what I've learned is the principles hold up. My job is to translate them into a means by which you can have access to them without having to teach you a whole new vocabulary. So that's what I spend a lot of time doing, is translating for people. So I'm often asked to provide an example of how I use language differently. So I'm going to actually use across a continuum here. Oftentimes in the corporate world, I'm asked to do what is called root cause analysis. That's corporate language or public sector language. And at its heart is this idea that we want to get down to the root cause of something. People who work in organizational structures, they totally get that. It's like real easy for them to digest. If I take that same principle and I bring it over to, say, professional or personal development, so this is a non-spiritual professional or personal development, we might talk to people about what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and I oftentimes talk about the weak link metaphor, which is essentially that you as a person are as strong as the weakest link in the chain of you. And immediately what people what they'll be able to do, setting aside whether they believe in strengths or weaknesses or all those modalities, they're immediately able to say, oh, well, let's talk about where my life is challenged, because that's where my weak link is, so I can get them right to the heart of the matter. If I were to come into a spiritual kind of setting or a transformational setting, there are a couple ways of talking about it. For example, if I were working with people with a monotheistic, typically Jewish, Islamic, or Christian orientation, we can lift from Jesus's language of looking for the block in the eye. A whole lot of people have heard that language. They're very comfortable with it. And so we can immediately cut to the chase of let's look for the block in the eye. If I'm working philosophically, in a transformational setting, I might actually use my language, which is seeing true, and say to people, let's look to see what we might be able to find that is blocking you off from your highest potential. So in a transformational setting, in a philosophical setting, that idea of realizing potential has a whole lot of traction. It's the same practice, it's the same principle, whether I call it root cause analysis or whether I call it block in the eye. What I know is that the principle is that no matter what, if they can get a good look at it, it becomes solvable. And so I just simply use language they're comfortable with, because it's far, far easier to help people by working in language they're familiar with, rather than trying to give them a whole new set of language. And the result is we're able to get onto the topic, onto the subject, tackle the issue at hand, and make some real progress, because we don't get caught up in all the translational problems. So that's actually a pretty good description of how you can work in any number of sectors, although I do have to add this because it's an important point. One of the challenges for all of us who work in the world as, call us problem solvers, is we get attached to our language. There's a particular way we like to talk about it. And the mistake we then make is we go around trying to convert people to talk as we talk, believe as we believe. And that just really doesn't work well, because the truth of the matter is, if you set people on a course where you've got to ramp them up on your language, you're wasting their time, because you're not talking about how they're going to solve it. So the result is that I've become a deep pragmatist and tried to learn how to give people things in ways that are instantly digestible for them, simply because it saves them time and usually a lot of frustration as well. It's a practical approach. A personal example is probably helpful. I'll use an example of a woman, let's call her Amanda. She would not be happy if I used her real name. So I began working with Amanda a while back. She had a number of challenges in her life. She came to me actually sort of through this transformational lens. It wasn't specifically a spiritual or religious orientation. It certainly wasn't professional. And the problem was that she was actually suffering a lot of distress and difficulty in her life. A lot of a sense of being overly responsible for both her kids, her husband, a number of things in the world. And she really was, her life wasn't imploding, but there was a lot of tension as a result, and so she needed some relief. We did a little bit of talk type work, just dialogue. Eventually, though, what we ended up settling on was an approach called breath work, where, she was a smart woman, so she knew a lot, and as many people have discovered, you can't always get at a root cause, an underlying block, by talking about it, because it's not in your thoughts. So we used breath work, and so I took her through a series of exercises of using the breath. She would close her eyes and breathe. And what we would do was take her out of her intellect and essentially into the feelings in the body. And one particular day, this was probably 4 sessions in, which, by the way, a lot of this just depends on how receptive people are to whatever they have to work on. Some people, it's a long process. Some, it's very quick. So it was about the 4th session. We sat down, and I asked her to close her eyes. We thought of a recent point of distress in her life. She identified feelings in the pit of her belly that she described as like ground glass. So I took her through a breathing exercise of working through that ground glass. And what ended up happening was it literally rose up through her body, the feeling. It rose up to be tension in her diaphragm, which we breathed with and through, which then moved up to be an ache just at the top of her breastbone, which we breathed through and worked through. And then as it moved, it went up to the tops of her shoulders and was held as tension. She literally could feel her muscles knotting up. At that moment, she said, it kind of feels like that's where I'm holding the responsibility for others. So we went and did some more breath work. And then a moment later, a look passed across her face, and I knew something had happened. So I said, so Amanda, what was that? She goes, it's the most amazing thing. It's like a video in my head. And I go, well, cool. What was the video in your head, Amanda? She said, well, I was probably only 6 months old. And my mom was holding me in the crook of her arm, and she was surrounded by her friends, and she was showing me off to her friends. And she said, Ron, I was like a porcelain doll on display. And she began to tear up, and I said, so what's that about? And she goes, well, that's the roots of my responsibility. My mom was a broken woman. I became the meaning of my mom's life. And I've spent my entire life being responsible for the well-being of others at my expense. At that moment, this look of, I'm almost a childlike look came to her face. And I asked her what was going on. She said, well, I just relaxed. And I said, that is really cool. And what that set into motion was essentially this whole new path for how she navigated the world. She wasn't done with it, but what she had, the reason this was particularly powerful for her, as it is for a lot of us, is that what she had was an experience, a physical, emotional, psychological experience of what it is to be in a space of okayness. She'd never had the feeling before. It was new terrain for her, but simply by having the experience, it gave her the ability to return to it over and over and over again. And she's made a tremendous amount of progress with it in her life and is much happier as a result. So the root cause was this thing when she was 6 months old that produced a profound effect on it imprinted her for life and needed to be brought into the light and into the sunshine so that we could get some relief from that particular shadow. It was really a cool one that she just sort of, popped right through it, and it was really neat to watch. A common question I get is, so like, how do you do this deal? What guides me? Well, I mean, any mantra is good for, there are all kinds of great things in the world. The one that I have a particular fondness for of late comes from a friend of mine. I've stolen it from him. And that is that we can't do these things alone, but we must do them for ourselves. And that those two coexist. Most of us, we're going to have some help because we can't get at things on our own. But in the end, nobody can do it for us. We have to do our own work. And so somehow or another we bring those two together and a path forms before us. The coolest part about it is that every single one of us, our path's a little different. We may face common challenges, but our particular path, our soul's work, it's going to be unique to each of us because that's the nature of what it is to be an individual soul working its way through whatever it is we're here for, which is pretty neat, actually. I'm a lover of people's stories because of that. A couple of books that might interest people. One is my most recent novel called A Killer's Grace, which is deep with philosophy and transformation. Another is a book, Seen True, 90 Contemplations in 90 Days, which is a workbook format, spiritual in orientation, both useful materials from my point of view. Of course, I wrote them, so of course I feel that way. You can find out a lot about what I've currently got going on in this sort of philosophical transformational space at seentrue.com, where I'm blogging and posting videos and all kinds of content that sort of moves this conversation forward. I have a pivot site, kind of what I named it, ronaldchapman.com, which kind of connects you to all the things I got going on. And some folks may be interested in sort of the professional component. That's available at a website, magneticnorthllc.com, where it'll kind of, put my professional photo on there, and you get to kind of look at the professional side of it. All those are useful. I'm particularly fond of Seeing True at this point because it seems to be the body of work I'm spending so much time in, and lots of good stuff there. Check it out.